Discovered by Christopher Columbus in 1492, Tortuga or Tortuga is a small, very steep island 37 kilometers long and 6.7 kilometers wide. Situated north of Hispaniola, a territory today shared by the Dominican Republic and Haiti, from which it is separated only by a strait of less than 10 kilometers, it owes its name to the shape of its mountain, which resembles from a distance a gigantic turtle shell. The island, omnipresent in Hollywood tales of piracy, acquired a reputation as a den, far removed from its reality. This reality is moreover far more fascinating than US-made cinematic fiction. It was in 1630 that Pierre Belin des Nambucq, a French filibuster, was driven from the island of Saint Christophe, today Saint Kitts, by the Spanish fleet. He then took refuge on Tortuga Island with 80 compatriots and expelled a small Spanish garrison, supported by communities of Buccaneers populating the northern part of Hispaniola, who supplied it with smoked meat, boucané, and fresh produce. The small French colony developed well. That same year of 1630, the word filibuster made its entry into French vocabulary, sometimes in the form of friboutier, a distortion of the Dutch vrijbuiter, and the English freebooter, he who takes free plunder. The term would soon designate all fortune-seeking sailors, pirates, or privateers who plied the Caribbean seas. In 1638, and for 2 years, Tortuga passed and repassed from hand to hand until François Levasseur, a Huguenot filibuster and former companion of Belin des Nambucq, obtained from the Lieutenant General of the Islands of America for the King of France, Philippe de Poissy, a commission to recapture the island. On August 30th, 1640, at the head of 100 filibusters, all Protestant like himself, he landed in the roadstead of Basse-Terre, the only place where ships could dock, and drove out the English. Recognized as governor of the island by right of conquest, Levasseur began by fortifying his territory. At the summit of a rocky mass overlooking the small harbor of Basse-Terre, he had a military fortification built, Fort de la Roche. Equipped with terraces, barracks capable of accommodating up to 400 men, an arsenal, and defended by cannons wedged between forests and precipices, the fortified structure guaranteed Tortuga's security. Very rapidly, the island became a flourishing commercial warehouse where buccaneers and filibusters came to sell and buy goods and merchandise of all sorts. A few dozen British colonists who remained ensured tobacco production. Ships were refitted there after expeditions, and liquor flowed freely in the few shacks serving as taverns. When in 1645 an imposing Spanish fleet of 6 warships presented itself before Tortuga, it was severely thrashed by the batteries of Fort de la Roche and the filibuster ships positioned in order of battle. Confident in his successes, Levasseur was seized by a sort of delusion of grandeur. He undertook indeed to transform his governorate into a Huguenot republic of the Antilles. He had the island's Catholic chapel burned and expelled its priests. The Protestant pastor, who had had the bad taste to contest this decision, suffered the same fate. Levasseur then instituted a tax on hides and skins, to the great displeasure of the Buccaneers. As for Fort de la Roche, it became a prison for the governor's opponents, who had lost all restraint. The cells, christened purgatory in mockery of Catholic beliefs, were doubled with iron cages called hell. It was therefore not without considerable general relief that Levasseur was finally assassinated in 1652 by 2 of his lieutenants. Levasseur's death allowed royal authority to take back control of the colony. A new governor, Henri de Fontenay, was appointed. A former knight of the Order of Malta, he was a veteran of the war against the Barbary pirates in the Mediterranean. Distributing letters of marque, he gave such impetus to naval warfare that the Spanish mounted a large-scale expedition against Tortuga, which they recaptured from the French in January 1654. 5 years had to pass before a cadet from Périgord, a former buccaneer returned to France, Jérémy du Rosset, obtained from the Minister of the Navy the title of Lieutenant General and Governor for the King of the Island of Tortuga, a promotion that did not cost the royal government dearly, since the island was no longer under its control. Moving heaven and earth, Rosset managed to outfit a small ship, aboard which in 1659 he set sail from La Rochelle with some 30 adventurers. In Hispaniola, he had no difficulty recruiting nearly 600 French buccaneers and filibusters who, divided into 2 groups, landed by night and seized Fort de la Roche and the island's facilities. But falling ill, Rosset returned to Europe. In 1662, the royal authority then appointed to replace him a certain Bertrand d'Orgeron. This former officer, captain in the Marine Regiment, had been a buccaneer, then a planter and merchant. D'Orgeron intended to make Tortuga a truly administered territory. He took possession of his governorate with 60 soldiers. intended to ensure a permanent garrison at Fort de la Roche. Moreover, he based his administration on a general clerk, 3 sub-clerks, and administrative personnel numbering about a dozen people. D'Orgeron would succeed in the double feat of making 2 authorities coexist, that of the King of France and the Company of the Indies alongside that of the Brethren of the Coast, the name given to the Buccaneer and filibuster societies of the Caribbean. Indeed, brief as their adventure had been, they had equipped themselves with well-rooted traditions, on one hand with the election and removal by vote of their officers, and on the other with the adoption of pirate contracts, a sort of social security that guaranteed filibusters' rights before an expedition, for loss of an eye, 100 écus or 1 slave, for loss of both, 600 écus or 6 slaves, for loss of the right hand or right arm, 200 écus or 2 slaves, for loss of a finger or ear, 100 écus or 1 slave, for loss of a foot or leg, 200 écus or 2 slaves, etc. Furthermore, a council of elders of 5 members was instituted, charged with arbitrating disputes and advising the governor in his choices. But Bertrand d'Orgeron's mandate was especially marked by a most original initiative. While encouraging corsair activity, as in 1666, for example, with the expedition against Maracaibo, the first of its kind since it was a land operation against a fortified city which, conducted by Michel de Basque and François l'Olonois, allowed 650 filibusters to realize a record haul, d'Orgeron grew increasingly weary of his subjects' indiscipline. Determined to make Tortuga a viable and pacified colony, he said to them one fine day, "I will have chains sent from France." And indeed, in 1667, the famous chains ordered by d'Orgeron arrived at Tortuga in the form of a cargo of 200 women to marry. These women, of all ages and all appearances, had been rounded up in the prisons of the Kingdom of France's coastal cities. The news naturally created a great stir in the Tortuga's taverns and gambling dens, where discussion and crude laughter were plentiful. On the appointed day, however, most of the filibusters and buccaneers awaited the gallant disembarkation in great silence, having made unusual efforts at grooming. The future brides were put up for auction. D'Orgeron had to recoup the cost of their passage after all, with an obligation for the buyer to marry his acquisition in proper form, before a priest or pastor, as he preferred. A rather cavalier procedure, but quite in keeping with the times. All the women found husbands, and the operation would later be repeated. Most of these marriages would moreover prove successful, the women adapting fairly well to their rough husbands, the latter tending to become settled under the gentle but firm pressure of matrimony. D'Orgeron would observe this himself. The number of brawls in Tortuga's taverns would significantly decrease after the arrival of the first conjugal convoy. Tortuga, as a filibuster society, was then experiencing its finest hours. At its height, it counted nearly 6,000 inhabitants, of whom 1,500 were buccaneers and as many privateers. The capital Basse-Terre grouped about 1,000 residents. Timber, hides, meat, and tobacco were produced there. Experiments with cotton, sugarcane, and coffee plantations proved difficult nonetheless. The Catholic filibusters even went so far as to impose a voluntary tax so that their chapel would be more beautiful than the rival temple. Yet the filibuster vocation of the island was coming to an end. In 1697, by the Treaty of Ryswick, France undertook to dismantle the base of Tortuga. Having lost all military interest, the island declined, while agricultural and commercial activities were transferred to Hispaniola. Their history ends, making way for myth.